The first paper is Climate Risk Disclosure and Institutional Investors, and the presenter is Ilhan.
Hello everyone, my name is Emir and I'm a PhD candidate at the Frankfurt School, and this is joint work with Philip, Zach, and Laura. I'd like to just start out by saying, thank you to the conference organizers for, including our paper in the program. I think it's really great and exciting to be presenting here. And we've been lucky to get some, great comments and suggestions on the paper and currently revising the paper. So it'll be very interesting hearing your input as well. And, given the time restrictions, I'll get straight into it. So financial market efficiency relies on timely and accurate information on firms' risk exposures. And one such risk exposure that is becoming more and more important is the climate risk exposure of firms. And when you look at both regulators and investors, they've pointed out so far the lack of quality and quantity of current disclosure practices about climate risks. To give one example, the former governor of Bank of England, Mark Carney, called for firms to do more to provide more and better climate-related disclosures in a speech in 2015. On the investor side, the ex-CEO of Norges Bank Investment Management stated that it would take him years before they get the kind of good data from portfolio firms that they need to build risk management tools. Having said all of this, when you look at things in the data, many firms still do not provide climate risk disclosures. So there's a recent survey evidence by my co-authors that institutional investors believe that climate risks have financial implications for their portfolios. And importantly, these investors also prefer engagement and not divestment when dealing with their portfolio firms, which I think highlights a potentially important role for institutional investors to remedy this situation about the lack of climate reporting. And similarly, there's a recent survey conducted by Strubel and Wergler that found that both academics and investors consider pressure from institutional investors to be the most powerful financial mechanism to reduce climate risk exposure and carbon footprints. And interestingly, in their survey, not one respondent thought that voluntary firm behavior would actually be a significant force to change. So in this paper, what we study is whether institutional investors can make a difference in mitigating climate change and associated risks by inducing portfolio firms to disclose more and better. And now the fact that many firms do not provide voluntary climate risk information implies that there are counterbalancing considerations at play here. So both Goldstein and Young and Christensen, Hale and Leutz provide reviews of the costs and benefits of disclosure, financial and non-financial disclosure respectively. And we employ concepts from disclosure theory outlined in these reviews to develop our hypotheses. And we also focus on what we call climate conscious institutional investors who plausibly have a stronger demand for such disclosures. Finally, we will distinguish between influence and selection effects of institutional ownership. That is, whether the investors induce firms to disclose more or investors choose to invest in firms that disclose more to begin with. Now, in case I do not finish in time, here's what we find in the paper. We provide a systematic evidence from a survey of institutional investors and observational data on corporate climate risk disclosures and institutional holdings. On the survey side, we find that institutional investors value and demand climate-related disclosures from their portfolio firms. So investors also find current disclosure practices to be insufficient and imprecise. Moreover, they perceive that markets are underpricing such risks. In the analyses based on the observational data, we find that climate-conscious institutional ownership is positively associated with the demand for more and better climate-related disclosures. And we finally find that both influence and selection effects play a role in explaining the relationship between institutional ownership and climate-related disclosures. So because of time restrictions, I will briefly go over our findings in the survey, but you can find much more in the paper. We find that most investors in our sample view climate-related disclosures at least as important as financial disclosures. Most investors also report that they actively engage portfolio firms to disclose climate information and to follow the TCFD guidelines when reporting. These investors also find that the current disclosure practices to be lacking in quality and quantity. We also look at investors that are located in countries with high environmental norms and universal investors, and we find that these groups of investors attach a greater importance to climate risk reporting, and they're more likely to engage with their portfolio firms to demand such reporting. And finally, the respondents who believe current climate risk reporting practices to be insufficient, they also see more underpricing of climate risks in the financial markets. For our tests based on the observational data, we first use voluntary climate disclosure data collected by the CDP, who are formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. And they collect data by sending out surveys each year to large firms around the world on behalf of institutional investors, and they ask firms to report on their climate risk exposures, carbon emissions, and all sorts of other related information. A caveat of this data is that because CDP does not reveal which firms they contact each year, it is difficult to identify whether a missing observation is due to refusal to participate or not having been contacted at all. So to remedy this issue, we use the fact that CDP typically sends surveys to largest publicly listed firms each year. And we create a sample of firms CDP likely contacted based on firm size in each country each year. And we focus on 3 different variables related to climate-related disclosures. First, we look at Scope 1 disclosure, which is an indicator variable based on whether a firm reported their Scope 1 emissions or not in a given year. Second, CDP asks firms to disclose the climate risks that they're exposed to in 3 different categories. Namely, these are regulatory, physical, and other risks. And we follow, Flammer et al. And count the number of categories a firm provided an answer for in this question. And it's going to be available between 2010 and 16 because the structure of the question changed in 2016. And finally, between 2010 and 15, CDP calculated a disclosure score between 0 and 100 based on the number of questions answered and how detailed these answers were. So we use this score as a measure of disclosure quality, so to speak. After 2015, their methodology to calculate the score changed, and now the new methodology conflates disclosure with climate performance. So for example, lower reported emissions now lead to higher disclosure scores, so we only have it available until 2015. On the institutional ownership side, we calculate institutional ownership as the fraction of a firm's shares owned by institutional investors from FactSet. And we focus on 3 different measures of institutional ownership that plausibly reflect a stronger demand for climate risk reporting. First, we have the stewardship code IO. This measure captures ownership from countries where investors are expected to follow stewardship codes that aim to promote corporate sustainability. So institutional investors subject to these codes should in turn have a higher propensity to demand climate risk disclosure from portfolio firms. Second, we look at what we call high norms IO, which is institutional investors located in climate conscious countries, and they should be more likely to demand climate related disclosures. So the fraction of ownership from such investors is high norms IO. And third, it's been shown that more climate related disclosures can actually lead to a reduction in firms' carbon emissions. And this positive externality would benefit universal owners more since they own a portion of the entire economy essentially. As such, we create universal IO as the fraction of firms' shares owned by institutional investors that rank in the 1% of all investors in terms of number of firms owned each year. And we also obtain information on firm characteristics and voluntary overall disclosure propensity or intensity as measured by Tsang et al. And control for them in our regressions. We will also have industry by year fixed effects and country fixed effects in all regressions. So in our baseline results, we regress our climate related disclosure variables on different climate conscious institutional ownership variables. And in all columns, we find that firms with higher climate conscious institutional ownership have a higher propensity to disclose their Scope 1 emissions, and they provide also climate risk information in more categories. So these firms also provide a higher quality climate related disclosure as proxied by the CDP's climate disclosure score. These effects are also economically large in magnitude. And just to give an example, the 1 standard deviation increase in stewardship code IO results in about 3 percentage point increase in Scope 1 disclosure, which is about 11% of the variable's unconditional probability. Next, we identify sort of the channels through which the relationship between climate-related disclosures and climate-conscious institutional ownership operates. And we look at 2 channels that are at work here. First, we consider the proprietary costs proxied by high industry competition, as in Hoberg and Phillips. We build on disclosure theory here, which suggests that in industries where competition is high, disclosure could be more costly for firms because they run the risk of revealing information about their business strategy to competitors. Indeed, we find that in highly competitive industries, or in other words, in industries where proprietary costs of disclosure are high, the relationship between institutional ownership and climate risk reporting is moderated. Second, a positive externality benefit of climate-related disclosures could be increased pressure on firms to reduce reported carbon emissions. This externality benefit, we argue, is the largest for firms in high-polluting industries, and investors concerned about the carbon footprints of their portfolios should focus on pressuring exactly these firms. And consistent with this line of thinking, we find that the relationship between climate-conscious institutional ownership and climate-related disclosures is amplified for firms in high-polluting industries. Now, the estimated relationship between climate-conscious ownership and climate-related disclosures may be for two reasons, as I alluded to in the very beginning. It might be that investors engage firms to demand more disclosures, which is what we call the influence effect. Alternatively, investors may invest in firms who already have good climate reporting practices, which we call the selection effect. And to try to disentangle these competing views, we explore two distinct settings. First, we look at the French Article 173, which mandates that French institutional investors must disclose the climate risk exposures of their firm portfolios. As a result, French investors need more information from their portfolio firms about climate risk exposures in general. And we take this regulation as a demand shock to climate-related disclosures. And second, we look at the United Kingdom mandatory emissions reporting regulation, which mandates that listed UK firms must now disclose their carbon emissions in their annual reports. And we take this regulation as a supply shock to climate disclosures. So consistent with the idea that French Article 173 constitutes a demand shock for climate-related disclosures by French institutional investors, we find that after the regulation passes, firms with higher French institutional ownership are more likely to provide Scope 1 disclosure, and they provide climate risk exposures information in more categories, as reflected in this climate risk disclosure variable. The effects are also economically significant. Again, for an example, Scope 1 disclosure increases by 4 percentage points for firms with high French IO post Article 173, compared to this 26% unconditional mean of Scope 1 disclosure. Next, we look at the supply shock that I just described to climate-related disclosures coming from this mandatory CO2 reporting regulation in the UK. And we specifically focus on firms who did not voluntarily disclose their emissions to CDP prior to this regulation. And we see that following the regulation, we find that climate-conscious institutional ownership increases in UK firms who are now forced to report their emissions, consistent with this selection effect of institutional ownership. Again, in terms of economic magnitudes, stewardship code IO increases by about 3.5 percentage points in UK firms compared to its 21% mean in the pre-reform non-complier UK firms. So to conclude, we study in this paper the role of institutional investors in inducing more and better climate risk disclosure from firms. We provide evidence that institutional investors value and demand climate risk disclosures from a survey instrument and in observational data. We further document that this demand is mediated by the costs and benefits of disclosure, consistent with the disclosure theory outlined in these papers. And we also show that the relationship between institutional ownership and climate-related disclosures is explained by both the influence and selection effects in the equilibrium.
Henri Servaes is the discussant. Thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very interesting paper. Let me just start with a quick summary and a discussion of the contribution. So there are really two parts to this paper. One part is a survey of institutional investors, and then there is an archival study. What does the survey of institutional investors says? It says climate risk disclosures are important, possibly more important than financial information. The current information and the management discussion on climate exposure is imprecise. Investors want more, they want it more standardized. and they both want to engage about disclosure, and they plan to disclose the carbon emissions of their own portfolios and climate risks of their own portfolios. And this disclosure is higher, and this now goes back to the archival work as well, for firms with higher ownership by investors, institutional investors, particularly if they come from countries with stewardship codes, from countries with high environmental norms, and from institutional investors who are larger. And using these two, the French and the UK experiment, there is evidence of both selection and engagement. The fit with the literature, clearly this improves our understanding of the importance of climate risk for institutions and the call for mandatory disclosure and standardization. Institutional investors seem to affect the emission and risk disclosures. And it's clear that not all institutional investors are the same. Stewardship code matters, social norms matter, and the size of the investors also matters. And so there's both influence, so they're pushing for more disclosures, as well as selection, selecting firms that are disclosing more. 3 sets of comments. It's a little bit unfair, of course, to say, well, what else should you have asked in a survey? But I'm going to still mention a few things. And I do think that they have maybe some answers that could get them in that direction, a bit about the interpretation of the results, and maybe other things that can be done to improve our understanding of the role of institutions in the disclosure of climate change. So in terms of what else they could have asked, I mean, we know institutions want more disclosure. I would have liked to know a little bit more about why that's the case. Now, maybe all the reasons I'm going to cite matter, but it would be kind of interesting, I think, to get some more sense of the weight, right? It could be that they need to disclose themselves, like in France, and so then it's just box ticking. This has no real effects. Or maybe they have an ESG remit, and then, of course, they need to know the emissions so that they can then exclude firms with emissions that are too high, and perhaps overinvest in stocks that have low emissions, which could simply come from preferences for low emissions. Now, that would have real effects, and we know from recent work in asset pricing that this would actually lead to higher valuations of low emission stocks, but and something that maybe not everybody appreciates, that would certainly lead to lower future returns. Maybe they don't have an ESG remit, but they still care about the ESG scores of the firms in their portfolio because they know that those scores affect flows. So that could be another reason. Or maybe they want to engage with the firms. They want to engage either because they think firms are doing the wrong thing and they want them to lower emissions, or because they have pure preferences for low emissions, and so they want to engage with firms for that reason. And so perhaps using some of the survey evidence together maybe with their archival data, it would be interesting to, for example, look at engagement to see how engagement changes before and after disclosures, whether there's more engagement for non-disclosures, etc. My second point is about interpretation. And the point, of course, is that carbon emissions and risk disclosures, they combine many aspects. And so the authors focus really on 3. I've got 2 of them listed here: whether they disclose emissions or not, and then whether they disclose climate risks. And there are 3 sets of climate risks. So that variable goes from 0 to 3. But of course, you really can't separate out disclosure from what is actually being disclosed. So there's also information about how much, about the quantities. And in fact, disclosure of climate risks may also be related to disclosure quality in general. And then finally, maybe this disclosure is all related to overall ESG performance. And so, I think there's always going to be a link between whether you disclose, which is the focus of the authors, and how much, what it is you disclose. And so here, I'd like authors to kind of better relate to what we know already. For example, we know that institutional investors influence ESG performance. And so presumably this climate disclosures go beyond ESG, but I'd like to know, is that really the case? We also know that institutional investors influence disclosure in general. And so again, are they capturing disclosure in general, or are they capturing something broader than that? So some more discussion on the uniqueness of maybe climate disclosures and contrasting it to disclosures in general would be useful. Then my next point is sort of related to, can we separate out disclosure from what is being disclosed? And more importantly, do investors actually need the CDP data to find out what companies are doing? Are there no other sources of information? Or maybe even more importantly, can they not infer some of the information? And there is some recent research that suggests that investors can actually infer this from a model that they can estimate based on industry characteristics, and that firms with high emissions have trade at a discount, but the discount is not dependent on whether they actually disclose or not, because it can be inferred from other data. So I would like to have the authors do a little bit more work on what would happen if they estimated disclosures for the ones that don't disclose, and then are they close or not, and what do the numbers of the non-disclosures look like once they're forced to disclose? Do they actually come close to the information you could infer anyway? So what's exactly unique about the CDP disclosures that help us out? Then there is a bit of a discussion on whether the types of institutions really matter. And so there is a regression of the disclosure of disclosure on ownership by these three types of investors. And I think you saw the same table in the presenter's slides. I think the numbers are a bit different because I know that since I prepared my discussion, they've got a new version of the paper. And so you find this positive relation between disclosure and ownership between these three categories of investors. But of course, they also look at ownership by the other categories of investors, those who are not subject to stewardship code, those who have low social norms, those who are not universal owners, and there the sign is often positive as well. And so to really make their case, they need to really compare the coefficients and see whether there really is a difference between the two or not. So that can be done. A little bit more discussion on the cost of disclosure, I think, would also be useful. Sort of my thoughts, why do companies want to do it? Well, maybe it's costly to gather the data. Maybe there is a surprise by investors that it's so high, and that may then affect climate risk and may lead to engagement. Then there is the possible cost of dealing with those engagements. And then there is the revelation of competitive information. And maybe if the authors could kind of provide a bit more richness on what the costs exactly are, particularly 2 and 3. I don't know if it's easy to get to 1 at all. On 4, they are arguing that it's competition, but I don't think that that's true. The effect of competition itself on disclosure is actually positive. It's weaker for firms with more climate conscious owners, but it does remain positive. So I'm not sure I agree with their competition interpretation. They then study whether it's influence or not by looking at this French requirement for institutional investors to disclose carbon risk exposure. And so they find that high French institutional ownership pre-event is associated with more disclosure after the event, suggesting that the French institutional ownership are pushing firms to disclose. And that may well be the case, but it could still be that it's simply selection, where institutions are simply selling out of shares in non-disclosing firms in anticipation of the law. And so then you find low ownership and low disclosure. And so the way to sort this out is to measure ownership long before the law takes effect or was even mentioned, so that the possibility of this law happening did not affect the ownership number. And then in their last test, they look at whether it's selection. And so what they do there is they study whether ownership by these 3 sets of institutional investors increases in UK firms after they are forced to disclose carbon disclosures, and they find that there's a positive effect. So this seems to support also part of the selection story. But again, you need to really compare the 3 groups that they focus on: the stewardship, the institutional owners subject to a stewardship code, high social norms, and universal owners, to the other ones. And so, if you look at the other groups, you find sometimes similar coefficients. So I'm not sure they're always going to be different from each other. So there seems to be something going on, but I'm not sure it's related to these specific types of institutional owners, and it's not about institutional owners in general. I do have a set of other questions and suggestions, but I think I've probably used up most of my time, and so I'll just share these suggestions with the authors. But overall, I think it's a very interesting paper. It really combines both an archival study and survey evidence. It's two papers in one. I would highly recommend reading it, and I learned a lot from reading it. And I very much look forward to seeing the next version.
Thanks so much, Henri. Really helpful to the authors, I think. Emirhan, we can allow just a little bit of time for you to respond.
I'll take half a minute to answer because I know we're tight with the time. Henri, thank you for the excellent discussion, first of all. I mean, I think you made a lot of great points. I'll just mention two things, one of which is sort of our fault as the authors because we were still updating the paper while he was preparing his discussion. We now do this pre-French IO point that you raised up about whether it is indeed selection versus influence thing, and the results seem to be unchanged. So it doesn't indeed, in that particular case, it seems like it is indeed the influence effect of this French reform. So that is somewhat comforting. And I wanted to bring up one of the things that you mentioned, which I thought was important, which you said, what's specifically important about the CDP data? Is it ESG performance versus not? I think when it comes to emissions, people have done their best to sort of estimate this type of information whenever it's not available. Like TrueCost, for example, does this. One difficult thing there generally is that especially data providers tend to estimate these types of data for people who did not disclose, but they do not do the same exercise for the firms that did disclose. So you cannot really judge the accuracy of this data. But even further than that, I think the CDP data provides the type of information that you can only get from the firms themselves. They provide, for example, these sort of future-looking types of risk exposures, and whether a firm is going to target to reduce their emissions in the future, you can only really ask the firm. You cannot really estimate that. So I think that part of the data is quite unique to our study, but I agree that we should discuss this further and and lengthen it. So that's all I say. All I'll say. Thank you for the discussion again, and I would love to have my hands on your slides.